Hello, cadets. Lieutenant Colonel Hogan here. This week for our learning opportunity, we're going to be talking about a couple of things. The first is the Department of Defense, and then following a brief overview of the DoD, we're going to talk about the active duty Army. This is based on the survey responses that I got from you that said you are interested in addition to the geography topics that we've just recently covered, you're interested in the makeup of the Department of Defense and a little bit about the military services. So that's what we're going to talk about this week. Like all of the JROTC lessons, initially we start by thinking about what you already know. What do you already know about government agencies, and what do you think of when you hear the letters DoD? And here's a softball question. Army JROTC is part of which government agency? Is it A, Department of Justice, B, Department of Finance, C, Department of Defense, or D, Department of Education? I know some of you thought Department of Education, and you'd be wrong because Department of Defense, of course, it's an Army, U.S. Department of the Army sponsored program. The student learning plan is posted in your weekly folder, but I want you to think about the following underlying question. How does the Department of Defense exercise control over the individual services? How does DoD exercise control over the individual services? And here are the learning objectives for the lesson. They begin with examining the mission of the Department of Defense. Next is to identify the four major responsibilities inherent in DoD's mission. Next is to explain civilian control over the military. Next is to determine the relationship between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Department of Defense. And then lastly, our key words or our vocabulary words for the week include operational commands, specified commands, strategic, tactical, and theater level. I'd like you to think about the structure and the function of the Department of Defense. DoD is headquartered at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., as many of you may know. And it comprises the Army staff, the Navy staff, the Air staff, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Staff. In this little wedge right here is the Army staff. This is the A ring, B ring, C ring. And in the third floor of the C ring, 3C747 is a little office that looks out onto this corridor, this little alley, and that's where I was stationed on the Army staff back when I worked in the Pentagon. The D ring and the E ring. On the E ring, generally the higher ups, senior officers and service secretaries had their offices, rarefied air. This was the courtyard, central courtyard in here, also known as Ground Zero, because back in the day, we knew that at least 500 Soviet weapons were targeted against this, and so that would be Ground Zero if there ever was a nuclear war with the Soviets. I would like you to think about how you would explain the structure of the DoD to someone from another country or another planet. Anyway, what information would you need to know in order to give this explanation? And at this point, I would bring your attention to the text reading that is in your weekly folder, and it's only about 6 pages for the Department of Defense. I'd ask that you go through that reading before you go a whole lot farther in this. The structure and the function of the DoD is as shown, or at least will in the next chart. I'll bring your attention to the fact that DoD is a cabinet level organization. Therefore, it has a secretary that works directly for the president at the cabinet level. The Army, Navy, Air Force, and 15 defense agencies report directly to the Secretary of Defense. And I know the inevitable question, Colonel, where is the Marine Corps? They're not shown up here, and I know that they're one of the military arms. They are. The Marine Corps, however, works underneath the Department of the Navy, underneath the Secretary of the Navy. Now, this following graphic organizer is a line and block chart that directly shows the organization of the Department of Defense. You'll see that it is headed up by the Secretary of Defense, again, a cabinet level secretary, and he's got a deputy. There's also the Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force. There's your three military departments. And as I mentioned before, underneath the Department of the Navy, you've got the Chief of Naval Operations, who is a four-star admiral who runs the Navy. And you've also got the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who is a four-star Marine officer. Both of those gentlemen work directly for the Secretary of the Navy. You've also got the Department of the Army. Lose my mouse, sorry. Department of the Army here, obviously the Secretary of the Army is the civilian secretary that leads the department, and the Chief of Staff of the Army is the senior four-star general, senior uniformed member of the Army. Same is true for the Department of the Air Force, the civilian secretary and undersecretary, etc. And then you've got the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, which is a four-star Air Force officer. Underneath OSD is a bunch of subject matter experts in specific areas that work directly for the Secretary. They're kind of like the Secretary of Defense's personal staff. Got the Inspector General. And then over here, I'd like to bring your attention to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are the Chiefs of Staff of all of the services, and they have a specific role to play. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the senior military officer in the Department of Defense, and the chairman is an advisor to the president on all matters of military operations. I'd bring your attention down here also to the combatant commands, and here are the warfighters, where the services are responsible for training and equipping military units. The combatant commanders are responsible for executing combat operations around the world. And you'll notice that they're broken up into different geographic regions. Central Command is Southwest Asia, European Command, Europe, of course, Joint Forces Command is an interesting one. We can talk about that later. Northern Command is Canada, the United States, Mexico, as well as the Arctic regions. Pacific Command, Southern Command is South America. Special Operations Command is worldwide. So is Strategic Command. So is Transportation Command. And then Africa Command is deals with the continent of Africa. There's also some DoD field agencies and activities that exist. And I'll let you take a look at this line and block chart. I tell you that if you are interested in knowing about what any of these are, go to the internet, type in a search command, and see what you can find out. Now, last thing. Underneath the Department of the Army here, you got the Chief of Staff, and then you've got the Army Major Commands. One of the four-star Army Major Commands is called Training and Doctrine Command, and that's where JRTC lives. Underneath Training and Doctrine Command is Cadet Command, a two-star command, and then underneath Cadet Command is Army JRTC. So that's your line and block chart for the Department of Defense. I know it's a lot of information. Study it at your leisure. The mission of the Department of Defense is to provide military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of the United States. Keep us safe. And the inherent responsibilities within that mission are to plan military strategy, maintain the armed forces, operate military bases throughout the world, and defend the country from foreign threats. As we mentioned before, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are the immediate military staff for the Secretary of Defense, and it is the senior uniformed members of all of the four services, plus the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's currently Army General, and advise the SecDef and the President on military policy and operations. The JCS has the following responsibilities, and that is strategic and tactical direction of the combat forces, operation of the combatant commands under the unified commands, integration of combat forces into an efficient team of land, naval, and air forces, and those are something called joint task forces, as well as conducting research and development in military arena. So here are the four major components of the DoD, obviously. Department of the Army, oldest service. Department of the Navy, next oldest service. You also have the Marine Corps, which is the third oldest service, and Department of the Air Force, which is the youngest service. Learn a little bit about each. Use computer resources and your search tools to find out information about each one. We'll just check learning real quick. Answer the following question. Whose mission is it to provide the military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of the United States? Is it A, Department of Homeland Security, B, the various state National Guard bureaus, C, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or D, the Department of Defense? It is, of course, D. DoD's mission is to provide military forces necessary to deter war and protect security of the United States. Look, there's an important aspect of the Department of Defense that we need to discuss, and that is the fact that the military is under civilian control. The U.S. structure of DoD calls for civilian control of the armed forces, and all of the senior policy positions within the DoD are civilian positions: the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Army, the Secretary of the Navy, and the Secretary of the Air Force. Each of those civilian secretaries have undersecretaries, and then they have civilian policy recommendations made by their staffs. Now, in many areas, there's overlapping military and civilian chains, but the ultimate policy decisions are given over civilian leadership. That being from the top down, from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the undersecretaries of the secretaries of the services. Now, I ask you the question, why is this the case? Why do we want civilian leadership over the military? Do you think about that? And in your weekly folder, there'll be a discussion board that gives you an opportunity to answer that question. So before we move on to the individual services, we'll just reflect a little bit about DoD. What have you found out about the Department of Defense? Secondly, why is this important to you? And then what else do you want to know about the DoD? If you have questions that you would like to answer in this week's or next week's education opportunity about the military services, you just put it in the discussion board and we'll be sure to address it. And to end this briefing on the Department of Defense, I'll just review the basic objectives of the military departments, and that is to prevent military actions that might threaten the safety of the United States or our allies, to defend the United States territories, waters, and airspace, and to engage in all necessary military operations and other assigned duties with the goal of ending hostilities in terms that are favorable to the United States. This has been a brief overview of the Department of Defense. I hope it's been enjoyable to you. I'm also going to park into the weekly folder a briefing on the Department of the Army. So thanks. Hope you're well.